with the last session of the conference. For those of you who are expecting Phyllis Moen, I'm sorry to disappoint. You get me instead. Phyllis is a good friend and colleague and mentor, and she just couldn't be here today. She had some other life course events going on, and so I am here in her stead. So this session is on the role of work environments. The first paper is going to be from an online presenter, Duygu Basaran Sahin. Dr. Basaran Sahin is a sociologist and demographer who recently earned her PhD from the CUNY Graduate Center. Her dissertation is on older workers' labor force transitions during the Great Recession. And currently she's a postdoc at RAND Corporation and the Center for the Study on Aging. And here she is on video. In broad strokes, her research interests center around social, economic, and health inequalities among the aging population in the United States. And the work that she'll be presenting today is based on research that she conducted as part of a team that received a pilot grant from the Life Course Center. So we're excited to hear about that. I'm going to quickly introduce the other speakers as well. Our second paper is presented by Dr. Harry Barbee. Dr. Barbee has recently started an assistant professor position in health, behavior, and society at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Barbee is an interdisciplinary social scientist who aims to identify, understand, and improve health and aging outcomes among lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer populations. Our third paper is presented by Dr. Renada Goldberg. Dr. Goldberg earned her PhD in family social science here at the University of Minnesota in 2020. She's currently an assistant professor in social work at Simmons University in Boston, Massachusetts. In addition to being a licensed social worker, her primary research centers the study of work and family by understanding employment-based opportunities and barriers experienced by marginalized workers with caregiving responsibilities. Her emerging area of focus is on employment precarity in the formal wage labor sector, growing gig work participation, and specifically the role of precarious work exposures as a family level stressor across the lifespan. And the work that she will present today is also based on research that was conducted as part of a Life Course Center pilot grant. And the final paper is presented by Gracie Venechuk. Gracie is a PhD candidate in her fourth and final year in the sociology department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research centers on health disparities and aging, with an emphasis on the role of worker context and job quality across the life course. So thank you, presenters, and Duygu, it's your turn.
So thank you. Today I am presenting joint work with Frank Heiland, Yin, and Ruth Finkelstein on perceived workplace ageism and racial ethnic disparities in cognitive functioning among older workers. Okay. So let's start with a quick literature review. We know that later life employment is beneficial for maintaining higher levels of cognitive functioning. The literature on discrimination also shows that discrimination, especially structural racism, is an important driver of health inequality in the US. Another type of discrimination, ageism, is found to have associations with worse health outcomes, higher levels of psychological stress, and in the workplace, it is associated with decline in work engagement and lower sense of belonging. So we wanted to know more about whether workplace ageism is related to poor cognitive functioning, given its negative association with health overall. We also wanted to know whether workplace ageism is a risk factor that may reduce the benefits of employment for cognitive performance in later life. I'm trying to find my mouse to move the slides, excuse me. Okay. So this brings us to research questions. What is the direction, magnitude, and significance of the relationship between workplace ageism and cognitive functioning among older adults? Is the association robust to well-known independent determinants of cognitive functioning? To what extent is the relationship mediated by occupation type, health, both physical and mental, and wealth? And then lastly, is the relationship moderated by race, ethnicity, sex at birth, and occupation? For this project, we are using data from the Health and Retirement Study. It's a nationally representative data of adults ages 51 and older in the United States. It has detailed questions on employment and cognition. Biannual and data are available since 1992 with a large sample size. The version we're using is provided by RAND, and we're getting the data from waves 2004 through 2018. In terms of methods and analytical sample, we did descriptive and multivariate analyses. We also took advantage of the HRS and analyzed the data both cross-sectionally and longitudinally. Today, the results I'll be sharing are coming mainly from the cross-sectional data, and then there will be some results from the preliminary work that we've done using longitudinal models. The analytical samples for the cross-sectional data, we pooled together the 3 youngest HRS cohorts. They were early, mid, and late baby boomers. We limited the sample to workers ages 51 to 56. And then those who were not self-employed, because the ages of questions were asked only to those who did not work for someone else. Excuse me, yeah, who worked for someone else. For the longitudinal data, we limited the sample again to workers ages 51 to 56 at the baseline. And then as I'll detail further, we only followed them for 1 wave to start with. And then we plan to do more with the longitudinal models. So we have 4 models. In the wave basic model, we have the 2 measures for perceived workplace ageism plus the demographic controls. So the demographic controls are age, sex, race, ethnicity, education, marriage status, and foreign-born status. Then in model 2, we add occupation type. Model 3, we add health factors. So we have self-reported physical health, depression, and blood pressure, high blood pressure. And then in model 4, we're adding household wealth. We also included a series of interaction terms of perceived ageism with race and ethnicity, sex, and occupation type. In terms of our measures, so we have 3 dependent variables. These are typically used in cognitive performance research. For those of us who are not familiar with it, serial 7 subtractions ask respondents to subtract 7 from 100 for 5 times. The number of correct answers are scored. So 5 is better than 4, 0 is the worst. For the immediate word recall variables, respondents are read a list of 10 words, and they are asked how many of those 10 words they remember immediately after being asked, and then a few questions later. So our key independent variables are either agreement or disagreement with the following 2 statements. Pressure to retire statement is my co-workers make older workers feel that they ought to retire before age 65. And then for the preference for young, the statement that the respondents are read is in decisions about promotion, my employer prefers younger people over older people. In this graph, I am showing you cross-sectional data results of bivariate analysis of cognitive performance by perceived workplace ageism. So the purple bar is representing workers' scores on the 3 outcomes. And then the orange bar is for the preference for young variable. So it's the difference between workers who don't perceive ageism minus those who perceive. So as indicated by the bars above the 0 line, those who don't perceive ageism in both measures do better in all 3 outcomes compared to those who perceive ageism. And these differences are statistically significant at the 0.001 level. This one is, I'm sorry, the chat popped up. This one is CL7 subtraction OLS regression results for workers perceiving ageism. So this is a more complicated graph, and I'll summarize it for you. So here we found that workers who agree with the 2 statements tend to do worse in CL7 subtraction outcomes. And the differences are statistically significant. However, as we added the variables that I showed you in model 2, 3, and 4, the effect size declined. For example, in model 1, we had the demographic controls. In model 2, we added occupation type. And then in model 3, we added health, excuse me. And then we see a decline from model 1 to 2, and then from 2 to 3 but we did not find such a decline in model 4, where we added wealth. This is a similar graph, but this time for the delayed word recall outcome. Again, we're showing you standardized coefficients for workers who perceive workplace ageism for the two outcomes. The biggest difference between this graph and the previous one is that we did not find statistically significant associations between workers who agreed with the preference for young statement and those who did not agree with the statement. However, for workers who agreed that their co-workers made older workers feel like they have to retire before age 65, did worse in this outcome as well in all models. And again, there was some change in the coefficients, but it wasn't as much as the one that I showed you for the CO7. We're not showing the results for the immediate word recall. It was very similar to this one. I also want to talk briefly about the interaction terms, for which we're not showing results either. Overall, the interaction terms were not statistically significant at the level we would have liked. The associations were also weak. Nevertheless, there are a couple of things that we could mention. So workers with blue-colored job histories tend to do worse compared to workers who had high-skilled white-collar job histories by perception of ageism. So the other thing we found was that older Latinx workers who perceive ageism did worse in CO7 outcome compared to older white workers who also perceive ageism. However, the statistical significance was only at the 10% level, so we did not include them here today. Okay, let's talk a little about the preliminary results using longitudinal data. So we had the baseline time t, and then we followed people for 1 week, which is 2 years. And we looked at the CO7 subtraction at time t as our outcome. Our key independent variable in these longitudinal models was the trajectory of perceptions of pressure to retire variable. We grouped people into 4 categories. So the first one is those who perceived pressure to retire in both waves. The second one is who did not agree with the statement in either wave. So no pressure to retire at all. The third category is those who reported to agree with the statement at time t, but then didn't report in t+2. And fourth is the case for workers who did not feel pressure to retire at time t, but then reported at t+2. And we also included baseline cognitive performance to see if that was changing anything, and as well as the demographic factors. So we kept it pretty simple for the preliminary results. The results provided no evidence of statistical significance for the association between ageism and cognitive performance that we found in the cross-sectional data. And I'll talk more about the next steps for this. So the conclusions we draw from the cross-sectional models is that older workers who perceive workplace ageism tend to do worse in standard cognition tests compared to those who do not. We found associations were sizable and robust to basic demographic controls. We also found evidence that health and occupation mediate this relationship. And based on the cross-sectional results, the benefits of employment in cognition might be counteracted by perceptions of workplace ageism. So this study contributed to the literature by being a novel study looking at the relationship between ageism in the workplace and cognitive performance among older adults. We took advantage of rarely used explicit measures of workplace ageism as opposed to ageism that happened to happen in the workplace. And then we found robust associations using high quality, nationally representative data specifically on older adults. Of course, one big limitation that comes to mind when we conduct cross-section analyses is that the estimates we found may be affected by reverse causality and or omitted variable bias. So we are exploring this further in the longitudinal models. And our next steps include to increase the follow-up period from 2 years to 4 and 6 years to see if there is any effect of cumulative exposure to perceived workplace ageism on cognitive performance. We also will run the analysis for the word recall outcomes for all models, not just the action terms. And lastly, we plan to include a stress indicator in the models to test whether the association of ageism with poor cognitive functioning operates through stress. As Sarah said, we gratefully acknowledge support from the University of Minnesota's Life Course Center, and we welcome suggestions, comments on this work. You can send them to me or to Frank and Na, who are also in the audience as virtual speakers, I should say. Thank you so much.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Harry Barbee. I'm a assistant professor in the School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins. And I'm going to be presenting some of my work on middle-aged and older LGBTQ plus adults and how their environments shape some cognitive health outcomes. Before I get started, I want to give a shout out to my collaborator, Dr. Tara McKay, who is an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. So a little bit of background to start. Although the research is mixed when it comes to health disparities, cognitive health disparities that LGBTQ plus people endure, the research does suggest that these populations may face risk of developing a variety of cognitive impairments in later life. And this may perhaps be tied to their exposure to a variety of minority stressors, such as harassment, discrimination, and violence that have been associated with worse health outcomes, many of which have been linked to cognitive decline in later life. Now, although there is growing evidence that workplace stressors influence cognitive health, we don't know too much about the mechanisms through which those relationships unfold. And this is particularly true when it comes to LGBTQ plus adults' experiences in the workplace. So in this study, I'm asking, how do LGBTQ plus supportive work environments influence cognitive health for middle-aged and older LGBTQ plus adults? So the data that I'm going to be drawing from today is from the Vanderbilt University Social Networks Aging and Policy Study. Particularly, I'll be drawing on wave 1. This is a panel study of middle-aged and older LGBTQ adults ages 50 to 76 at wave 1. Broadly examining their social networks, social experiences, social support, political context, and health and aging over 3 waves. At wave 1, respondents reside in Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Well, we've already collected data through the first 2 waves, currently collecting wave 3 data. Here are some panel characteristics you can see across state, gender identification, race, and age. I don't include sexual orientation on here, although it's about 97% identify as either gay or lesbian. All right, so the first outcome variable that I'm looking at today is subjective cognitive health outcome. And for, in this study, I'm using a modified version of the informant questionnaire of cognitive decline in the elderly. So this is a 16-item index that asks respondents about their experiences of a variety of different memory and memory-related tasks, such as remembering my address and phone number, handling money for shopping, knowing how to work familiar machines around the house. 2 focal predictors that I'm looking at first include major work problems. So we asked in roughly the last year, have you had any major problems at work? These can include anything from shorter hours or overwork to not getting along with people. And then we also assessed supportive workplaces for LGBTQ plus people by asking in general, how supportive were your coworkers of your sexual orientation or gender identity? In our models, we control for a variety of variables that are often associated with LGBTQ plus people's experiences of their health in relation to the workplace. All right, so a couple results to start. So first, we're looking at the influence of having major problems at work within the last year. All right, so first, one group says, no, I don't experience major problems at work in the last year. The other says, yes, we do. And perhaps unsurprisingly. The respondents who said, yes, I do experience major problems at work, had a 61% higher rate of cognitive difficulties compared to those who did not report any major problems at work. But pushing this a little bit further, as I said, I wanted to understand, okay, well, what does it mean for those who perhaps work in an environment where their LGBTQ plus identity is supported? So both of these groups, and keep in mind, all these folks, all these respondents are LGBTQ plus individuals. So, but they're all saying, yes, I experienced major work problems in the last year, except one of these groups actually says, well, yes, I'm experiencing major problems at work, but my colleagues support my sexual or gender identity. All right, so what does that mean for cognitive health? Well, our models show that respondents who reported major work problems, but did not report having LGBTQ plus supportive coworkers had a 54% higher rate of cognitive difficulties. So these were sort of the first analyses that my colleagues and I ran, but again, I want to push this a little bit further and think about perhaps how these relationships are unfolding in a more nuanced way. So here you can see, here you can see a conceptual model for some structural equation models that my colleague and I developed, looking at how all these variables perhaps relate to each other. So not just looking at the direct effects of major problems at work and supportive coworkers on cognitive health, but also perhaps how conditions such as mental distress problems, sleeping, and vascular disease influence those relationships. Now, in this case, for the cognitive health outcome, we instead of just looking at this continuously, we are using 4 or more reports of cognitive difficulties as a conservative cutoff point for symptoms consistent with mild cognitive impairment. Okay, so first, looking at how the influence of major problems at work. So those who reported having major problems at work in the last year were significantly more likely to report symptoms consistent with mild cognitive impairment. And in fact, those who reported major problems at work were 96% more likely than their counterparts to report subjective MCI. And these were this relationship was mediated through mental distress and problems sleeping. So then looking at the indirect effects of having LGBTQ plus supportive coworkers. So as you can see, I did not find a significant direct relationship between having supportive coworkers on subjective MCI, but there does appear to be an indirect effect operating through major problems at work, namely those who reported having supportive coworkers were significantly less likely to experience or report major problems at work, and in turn, less likely to report symptoms consistent with mild cognitive impairment. So here you can see the full model showing all significant pathways. And so overall, the total indirect effect for those who had supportive coworkers, they were about 64% less likely to meet the criteria for mild cognitive impairment. So what are the potential mechanisms happening here? So first, it could be that the stress of working in a non-LGBTQ plus supportive environment compounds the harmful effects of everyday work stress. So many people experience work stress, but if you're also working in an environment where you don't feel supported, perhaps that amplifies that stress you're already experiencing. But it could also be that LGBTQ folks who work in supportive environments are able to develop positive relationships with their colleagues. And it's possible that those relationships help them better cope with the stress that they're enduring. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for coming to today's session. My name is Renada Goldberg. I am an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at Simmons University, which is in Boston, Massachusetts. And along with me on this project are my colleagues, Janette Dill, who is an associate professor right here at the University of Minnesota in the Health Policy and Management Department. And we also have a colleague at UNC Chapel Hill, Ji-Yoon Kim, who's a PhD candidate. And without these two, it took a village, I'll say it that way. I want to, before I get started in the rest of the presentation, I want to provide acknowledgement that we are extremely grateful for the support from the University of Minnesota Life Course Center on the demography and economics of aging. We received a pilot grant for this study and want to say thank you for that. A brief agenda. I want to first give a super brief introduction to work precarity. I realize that in the United States, not many people use this term to talk about insecure or unstable work environments. It is growing in popularity, but it's still in the US, at least we're still on the frontier of this type of work. I want to briefly discuss about the theoretical foundation. Again, I am a social worker. We use a lot of theory in our work. I'm going to then move us on to the study's research questions, our conceptual model, present data, explain the sample, our variables, our analysis plan, present the results. And because this is a preliminary and a pilot study, we acknowledge that there are limitations, and we're going to talk about future research. So first, my brief introduction to work precarity. I really like, oh, it didn't look so well. I really like Vasco's definition for work precarity. And she says that when we think about work precarity, that we must acknowledge that is work for remuneration. So you're being paid for it, typically in a formal wage setting. And it's characterized by uncertainty. It's characterized by having low income, limited social benefits, and yet confined by statutory entitlements, meaning that there are laws and there are policies that kind of govern not only how the worker experiences work, but the policies and structure that kind of define their work. It's also shaped by the intersection of employment status, which is like part-time or full-time, form of employment, whether it's casual, whether it's permanent, temporary, the labor market insecurity, the social context in which the person is working in that particular job. And we're thinking about the social location of the employee. That part tends to not be discussed as much. We tend to focus on what's happening in this work environment as opposed to what is the social context in which the employee is working. Discrimination, ageism, racism, all the isms. And then I really like the definition by Standing, and I kind of added on to this, is that there is an emerging precariat class that takes into account economic, employment, and well-being and security. And so it's these three different forms of instability that come together to make a really, to make a class of employees that are experiencing the most economic and employment instability. Okay, so now that you have that in your heads, I came up with my colleague, Catherine Solheim, also here at the University of Minnesota, about conceptualizing employment precarity. And so we want to recognize that there are these work factors that have precarity, but when we're thinking about employment precarity, we have to, again, take into consideration the worker's social location. We have to consider the cycle of precarious employment. One is constantly changing from one precarious job to another. And then we're thinking about the longevity of that precarious environment. If they're spending lots of time in a really crappy job. Sorry, I'm a social worker. And when I tell my students what I do, I say, I research bad jobs. And they're like, well, what job isn't bad, Dr. Goldberg? And I say, well, come to my class and find out. And so when we're thinking about these factors, this all really comes together in what I consider to be like a state of employment precarity. Okay, and so what we know about work precarity, employment precarity, and marginalized social identities is that, well, the research on mechanisms of work precarity as a social determinant of health is limited and tends to focus on traditional working-aged adults 25 to 55 years old. Older adults experience a weathering process that Garcia and colleagues talked about, where it's the structural and the systemic inequities that tends to exacerbate health conditions and accelerates biological aging. The service sector has long been characterized by work precarity as compared to other industries in the United States. And non-college workers are far more vulnerable to non-standard and low-wage work as compared to college graduates. Black, Indigenous, and workers of color are overrepresented in the service sector, and work precarity and industry may interact to contribute to minority health disparities in the United States. And then finally, the degree of work precarity experienced in particular by older low-wage workers are under-examined and under-theorized in the literature. Okay, so now you're caught up to that. Our research questions for this project were, one, can work precarity be understood as a latent variable? So going back to that first graph that I just showed about how all these different factors, does it combine into a latent variable that we can kind of carry with us through the rest of the research? And that's good because on a policy front, in the United States, we tend to address precarious work piecemeal. So we're looking at low wage, access to healthcare, access to family supportive work benefits like paid sick leave. And so it's actually in our best interest to kind of be able to bundle this package of bad job factors. And then instead of continually addressing one aspect. Our second question, I should say, comes to, can work industry predict later disability status? So like I just said before, if service sector jobs carry more precarity than other industries, then perhaps we can look at the industry as a whole, and if we can see if that predicts later disability. Our third question, does work precarity interact with work industry in ways that impact workers' health outcomes as they age? Does work precarity exacerbate the service sector effects on older age workers? And then finally, are there differences in the relationship between work precarity and disability across racial ethnic groups of older non-college workers in healthcare, retail, and food service? And so we're looking particularly at these three industries as compared to all other industries, because they do carry more precarious factors, and they have a overabundance of marginalized workers in these jobs, socially marginalized workers, social economically marginalized workers. It's probably better to see this as a map, and I'll refer to this later in the presentation. And so our model, so I have the questions posed here and the directions that we're looking at based off the questions. And so our sample and our data, we're using the Survey of Income and Program Participation, the SIP data. We're using specifically the 2014 panel, which includes years 2014 through 2018. We chose to use the SIP data because it has a variety of work and health variables that we can choose from and pick from. And it has a large sample. And so when we restricted the data to 50 to 65, to participants who were 50 to 65 years old, they had less than college education. This became our base group. And so we had 7,621 folks. The SIP universe includes the non-institutionalized resident population living in the United States. And the strengths of the SIP are that it includes the longitudinal panel design, large sample size. We have rich data on employment and employment transitions during the survey period. Okay. And so our variables, the variable outcome is we are looking for disability status reported in 2018. The independent variables that we're looking at are industry, which was a categorical variable, healthcare, retail, food service. We're looking at precarious factors that we dichotomized, such as if one works, if their wage is less than $15 an hour. I have lots of thoughts on that. That's not a living wage, but it is a number that is constantly used in the research when we're thinking about economic mobility. And in the United States, we also tend to have $15 as like a goal in in policy to use that as the new baseline standard. We're looking at part-time work, which would be less than 35 hours a week. The income poverty, not ratio will be less than 1, and if they have Medicaid status. The demographic factors we use are sex / gender, which I can spend a whole session talking about, but I am on a time clock. Race, age, education, region, and if folks reported that there was no reported disability. We use data 17.0. We ran a confirmatory factor analysis, again, to examine this work precarity latent variable. And then we moved on to use logit analysis. And because we're social scientists, we use, of course, P as the baseline of 0.05. Okay, so the fun parts, the study results. So coming back to our great map, for the first question, which was, can work precarity be understood as latent variable? Was unfortunately no. And the model would not converge. And so what we have here, what I embolden as in black is that low wages, that our variables that we use were low wages, irregular non-standard hours, access to healthcare, and low household income. Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah, and so you can see here, this is one of our graphs, is that there just wasn't a significant difference in the role of industry. Oh, that must be question 2, sorry. Okay, well, that was no, that we didn't have any significant findings there. And to go back, is that you can see here on this graph is that it just wasn't statistically significant. And then our third question, does work precarity interact with work industry in ways that impact workers' health outcomes as they age? And the answer was yes. I just want to show you this quick table with statistical significance. We saw that the various factors, since we couldn't come up with this latent variable based off the variables that we're using as proxies and from the SIP data, we did see that wage had an impact on that low wage had an impact on whether folks claimed disability status. For healthcare industry and retail industry, part-time status was significant for those who worked in low wage healthcare. And household poverty really was significant when we looked at people who worked in retail. Having Medicaid status did not, there wasn't anything that stood out significant. And then I have some graphs here that we can just see, well, you may be thinking, well, your main effects, you didn't have any statistical significance. Why would you do the interaction? Well, the interaction shows that work precarity actually exacerbated the conditions that we found in these industries. And so in blue are those who made over 15 hours on this left graph, made over $15 an hour. Orange was those who made less, and you just see the difference in all of these, in all of them actually. And in the interest of time, the fourth question, how about looking at race, age, and all the other demographic factors? Those were not statistically significant. But they were when we looked at age and when we looked at people who had less than high school diploma. And so some limitations is that despite multiple time points available, we only used the 2 time points. Random or fixed effects modeling could be a better statistical fit for this data. The CFA could have been more robust with more factors tied closer to theory. And the precarity latent variable has been found in previous research, but why not here? And finally, thinking about the future of work, we're going to continue trying more models using the longitudinal data, and we're going to examine the robustness of work precarity factors and the validity of using proxy variables for precarity. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Car, for that lovely introduction. I'm Gracie. It is my pleasure to be here today to talk to you about some nascent work that I'm doing, looking at the individual level characteristics and state level characteristics on health for service sector workers. I used to be a service sector worker, so this is a project that is quite near and dear to my heart. So a little bit of background, Dr. Goldberg just set this up beautifully. So this feels redundant, but I will do my spiel anyway. I think as most people here know, job quality in the United States has been declining for quite some time. It really started with wage stagnation in the 70s, but policies that have encouraged employer flexibility over employee security, that have pushed for outsourcing have really dismantled the security of most jobs in the United States. Like even good jobs, we are seeing higher levels of work hour creep. So people are working longer and they're feeling greater senses of precarity in terms of fears about whether they'll be able to retain their job. However, it has also created a dynamic of polarization where there are more good jobs and more bad jobs, and particularly in the bad job category, again, as Dr. Goldberg was just discussing, service sector workers are a huge concern. This is an area of work, bless you, which has really increased over the last few decades as manufacturing has left, service work has gone up in the US. And so recent work from the SHIFT project out of Harvard and Berkeley has found, for example, that service workers who were surveyed did not take time off from their jobs for qualifying events such as like having a child, which is a big deal, primarily because they were concerned that they would lose their job for leaving or they didn't have secure enough wages. And other work has found that they experience higher levels of sleep disruption and distress due to schedule instability and low wages. However, it is unclear whether the issue here is are these jobs just bad? Or do we not have good enough worker protections at the policy level? Because there is a fair amount of variation in the policies, which are particularly critical for hourly wages from state to state. For example, 9 states have a minimum paid rest requirement under state law, and 19 have minimum length of meal laws. And of course, for tipped workers, some states demand that employers pay their tipped workers minimum state wage before tips. However, some only ask their employers to pay minimum federal wage, which is $2.13 an hour. So as you can see, there's a lot of variation in how people are working and experiencing these jobs across the US. So within this context, I had 2 questions. First of all, I wanted to know to what extent did individual job characteristics versus state level worker policies were they associated with self-reported health of service workers? And second, because service is not a monolith, there's a lot of variation in these subsectors, I wanted to know, do these relationships vary as a function of service work type? So at the individual level, my data comes from the annual social and economic supplement of the current population survey. I downloaded it from IPUMS. Thank you so much for your beautifully harmonized data. I had 152,732 individual observations for 2022, a number of exclusions. I tried to cap my age range a little bit just to kind of capture as many like working age people as I could without the polls being in there. Folks who were not in the armed forces, obviously, who were missing from employment entirely or were not in the service sector, who were self-employed or unpaid family workers. And then, of course, because this was initially intended to be a multi-level analysis, I limited it to 1 individual per household for a final sample of 8,144 adult civilians in service work. And with regards to service work, I operationalized this idea using 2 different sources. First of all, the census, occupational terms, so how they define what the service sector is. But then I also pulled from the literature a little bit as well, who is generally classified as a service worker. Because retail workers actually are not classified under the census as service workers, but often are in theory. So I had 5 different groups. The first was retail workers, cashiers, and counter clerks. Second is food prep and serving. These are your line cooks, your baristas, your waiters. Third is cleaning and maintenance. These are your janitors and groundskeepers. Fourth are personal care service. These are barbers, nail technicians. And then 5th is healthcare support. These are CNAs, these are MAs, these are pharmacy techs. So my independent variables were hours worked. I included a continuous and a squared term since we know that both working too few hours and too many hours is bad for you. I have employee-sponsored health insurance, employer-sponsored pension or retirement plan, and then I have a categorical variable for personal annual wage salary income, and of course, type of service work. I also include a number of controls, including age, racial identity. Unfortunately, I just did white versus non-white just due to power, gender, marital status, presence of children in the home, educational attainment, and then household income above and beyond personal annual wage and salary. For my state level variables, I was guided broadly by the Oxfam Best States to Work report. This is a beautiful report if you are interested in policy and work and health. They put it out every year. And for this particular study, I had two sort of separate questions. I was wondering, are there certain policies that are important? Is there a single policy that really is protective here? Or is this a holistic thing? Do we need sort of a number of policies working in tandem? So with that in mind, I look at both the single policies and then also the Best State to Work Index. For the single policies, I'll note that the right to work law, since this isn't obvious, is actually not a good thing to have. It tends to suppress unionization in states, so that's why that is coded as 0. I also include a number of state level controls, including the proportion of the state living below the poverty level, state income level, inequality, and racial composition. So now we get to the methods. This is where things get a little bit exciting. I had originally intended, as the title suggests, for this to be a multi-level logit model based off of theory and prior work that made a lot of sense to me. Workers are nested within states. However, when I dug into the modeling strategy, I found that my interclass correlation was incredibly small. It was nearly 0. My likelihood ratio test was not significant. And when I compared estimates at a multi-level versus a single level model, they were nearly identical. So after much hand-wringing, a few tiers, and several discussions with our statistical consultants, I pivoted to a single level logit model. And for this model, I ran several different sort of model types. The first was looking at service work individual characteristics and specific state laws. The second was individual characteristics and the Best State to Work Index. And then finally, I stratified my models by type of service work. So these are my descriptives. I won't spend too long here, only to point out that this is a pretty healthy sample. Only 9% of these people reported poor or fair health, and also that the service sectors were fairly well distributed in this sample, with the smallest group being personal care and health service. Again, these are descriptive statistics for the state level policies. These are proportions of my sample for whom these policies applied. So this is the first table of my results. Actually, this is the only table because tables are terrible. As you can see in my first model, they are, there are some significant effects between these work-related individual level characteristics and odds of higher self-reported health. However, these effects are attenuated with the addition of the individual level controls. And further, neither my state level individual policies nor my Best State to Work Index are significantly associated with odds of better or worse health in this model. So not super exciting for the whole sample. However, when I pivoted to the stratified model, things look a little bit different. So I included this figure over on your right, just to show you all of the service types, but it is very messy. So I then pulled out just the ones that were significant. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to look at the state level policy and Best States to Work Index from here on out. So as you can see, among retail workers, living in a state where there was no right to work law was associated with higher odds of reporting good health. Whereas with my healthcare service workers, living in a state with paid family leave or sick leave law was actually associated with lower odds of reporting good health, an incredibly vexing finding. But it shows up elsewhere, so we'll talk about this. So these are the results from my Best State to Work Index. These are the fully adjusted models, and these are the predictive margins. And as you can see, for food service workers and retail workers, the pattern is kind of what you would expect, right? Like working in a state that has better worker protections is associated with higher probability of reporting good, very, or excellent health, which again, maybe makes sense for these workers because these tend to be pretty volatile sectors, high turnover with precarious scheduling. But we get to the other sectors. It was not significant at all for maintenance or cleaning workers, nor for personal care workers. And then, and this just makes me want to tear my hair out, it was negatively associated with health for my healthcare support workers. Yeah. So, some tentative conclusions. Both individual and state characteristics do appear to matter for the health of service workers. And to the extent that these policies in particular matter, it seems to vary as a function of subsector for workers. So this is important when we're thinking about understanding the service sector and service workers. They can't be considered a monolith. There's a lot of variation in here. Workers in jobs, for example, which may be less likely to have a union, such as food service, may retain greater benefits from some of these state worker protection policies. And finally, I think this provides some at least initial evidence that a broadly protective labor environment is really important. Sort of a onesie-twosie approach with policy for labor may not do it. There isn't really at least in this model, one policy to sort of rule them all. It's the coming together of all of these policies that creates a supportive and protective work environment that appears to matter more. So of course, there are a number of limitations to this study. First of all, my sample size was relatively small for a multi-level model, and self-reported health, while a traditionally excellent variable, it's such a workhorse, it's really well correlated with mortality and morbidity in later life, is still fairly limited. There may be a number of other processes occurring here. So I would love to explore this same modeling in other data sets and see whether with better work and health variables, whether I find sort of similar results. Of course, there were limited work-related variables in this data as well. This is something I hope to ameliorate by merging in ONET variables in the future via occupation. There's the mystery of the healthcare support workers. And to this, I've been trying to think about this within the context of possibly drilling down a little bit further, both in terms of occupation and in terms of place. So looking at whether there are certain sub-occupations within healthcare support that might be driving this finding. Are these people distributed in a very specific way within these states? It could be that my healthcare support workers are primarily working in rural versus urban areas. So I think there's something to tease out there. And finally, eventually, I hope to look at this along age gradation as well. So for groups of folks, ages 20 through 30, so on and so forth, because I think that we will find different things at different stages of the life course. So thank you all so much for your time and attention. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and contact me. That is my email.